Hey, what's going on? This is Brad from the Ed Army, and today, as you can tell by the thumbnail, we have a brand new theory. So obviously, with the announcement of Pokemon Legends ZA, we have a lot of stuff to talk about in the entire Pokemon sphere as a whole, and I have some theories going on, and I want to get into mine. But as always, just want to give you guys a shout out and saying thank you guys so much. We're on the race to 250 subs, and I'd hope you'd like to join for the ride. And also, there is a bit of an channel update with this quick. I just want to say a lot of my content will be changing in terms of the focus. So pretty much for this channel, it's just going to be off the cuff, the Digimon stuff and my Pokemon videos that are going to be becoming the main focus. I will not be getting rid of my Yu-Gi-Oh content, more so that I'm going to shift it to Rumble, because I do think my Rumble account deserves some love, and I want to put that stuff there because I think some of the or most of the Yu-Gi-Oh content is getting more hits there, and for the most part, there's a lot of people to compete with in the sphere on YouTube. So in Rumble, I'd rather you people enjoy it there because, there's so many options there. I mean, so many options here, and there's less options there. So, just enjoy it. But pretty much, I want to get into today's theory, and today's theory is a pretty interesting one that I have, and since we don't have any leaks yet, I don't want to ruin anything, because if there were some leaks, then this wouldn't matter. But let's talk about ZA and kind of how I think we're going to get a lot of the exposition done. Now, the reason why I wanted to talk about ZA specifically and this whole story is that I think we're getting a lot about Zygarde, and I want to be able to talk a lot about Zygarde because I think Zygarde was one of the underappreciated legendaries up until the point of, probably Gen 7, because that's when we got the 100% Zygarde, but the anime tried to do its best to explain Zygarde, and I do think it helps with a lot of the issues of Zygarde. But today we're going to be talking about what I think ZA is going to focus more on, and explaining that pretty much I think that Zygarde has a purpose of being the order Pokemon. We did see a little bit of it in the anime, but I think this will give us a definitive explanation of why he's called the order Pokemon, and explaining that the other legendary Pokemon that I do think will be coming out, that which is the A Pokemon that we will see, its explanation and how it exists in the whole broad stream of this theory and the world of Kalos, because I do think this would make a lot of sense. There's a lot of gaps in the Kalos story from specifically the game, and I do think the anime as well, that would help be explained if this was the case. So here I go, let's dive into it. So we're going to start off with Zygarde and explain some of the intricacies of Zygarde. So I do believe in the ancient past, this was probably the more prominent thing. Zygarde's 100% form that we do know is actually probably the correct form that Zygarde takes normally. Now, for this theory, we're going to talk about ancient Kalos, so probably the time prior to the war even, so probably a couple thousand years before that, where we have the beginning of Zygarde. So in the anime, we know that Zygarde is one of the legendary Pokemon that is talked about in the legends because it gets mentioned a lot by Team Flare. And strangely enough, Zygarde is the one that's pursued, not Xerneas and Yveltal. So there are a few things for this that I will explain because there are differences, but this is important for the legend. So we do know that Zygarde is a very prominent figure in the Kalos region, and its presence was very important for the history of the region itself. When we move into its position in terms of what it does for the ecosystem, Zygarde is probably a defense mechanism created by something, could be Arceus, could be anyone, to protect Kalos' environment. Now, we see this actually as a different way than most, because by the time of the actual series, we see Zygarde in its cell form, or I almost want to call it proto form, but that's not right. But in its cell form, which is the core, it's the little squishy, form it takes place of. And then it obviously moves into its 10% form, which roams the lands. And I believe Zygarde uses this to traverse areas to check it out. And then when it decides that there is other situations that are a little bit more dangerous or worrisome, it sends in the 50% form. So for this theory, I wanted to explain that I believe that we will see Zygarde actually in its retainment 100% form, but it'll have an explanation that Zygarde actually took this form permanently in the past. So that's at least my belief, is that the 50% form, the 10% form, and even the core form of Zygarde, they exist, but they don't exist in the same sense that the 100% form is. Because 100% is called usually complete, this probably means that Zygarde was originally this form all the time. But it wasn't until more recent times that it had been forced to take into its other forms more more constantly, where this must have been where its cells and stuff were scattered, so there was a purpose to that, obviously. But for my theory, I do believe there was 100% Zygarde all the time in the ancient past, and it would send out the various forms that we would know as, little messengers and little not instigators, but checking the area, obviously, to make sure everything's safe. So that's where like the 50%, the 10%, they would go out and look. Now we move into, obviously, probably why you clicked on, the theory of the A Pokemon. So in, I believe, Kalos' ancient past, there was a Pokemon that shared the space with Zygarde. This was the Pokemon that I believe ruled over life and death. So think of it like the proverbial Grim Reaper. And for the sake of the video, I'm going to be calling this Pokemon Apocalypse. So Apocalypse is just the name I came up with. I like it being purple, I like it having the horns. You'll kind of be able to figure out maybe why later on, but I think Apocalypse is an important Pokemon because I do think this will be the A Pokemon that we will see. Believe it or not, I think that this Pokemon, also its name is based off of 3 things. Obviously Apocalypse, the other part is attack, because Zygarde is obviously a reference to it being a guardian. This is in reference to this thing being an attacker. And then Lisp is like a wisp, so obviously when it shows up, there's like a wisp of area, which focuses on the aura aspect that this Pokemon would possess. But we have to talk about what Apocalypse would have done alongside Zygarde. So basically Zygarde worked, in my opinion, and how it functions is that it works as the guardian of maintaining ecosystem order. So basically just making sure there's a maintained balance. But it never explicitly tells us that Zygarde is actually an administration of, focusing balance. It only uses its power to establish it, which means that there has to be something else that kind of tips the scales from whether it's unbalanced or balanced. And this is where I think Apocalypse exists. So Apocalypse would show up in areas that were originally way too far barren, maybe deserts, wastelands, and with its power of control over life, it can restore these areas. So it can bring life back to these areas, turning the desolate lands back into, really nice forests and, areas of possible living. Then we see Apocalypse going into a place that's probably way too overrun. There's too much life. It causes too many issues for whatever purpose it serves, and it uses its powers of death and destruction to absolutely decline the area to a point where it can manage balance. So effectively, Apocalypse works as the alternate form, or not alternate form, but the alternate being of Zygarde, where Zygarde checks to make sure everything's okay. Apocalypse actually deals with making sure everything is okay. So like if there's one thing or another, Zygarde basically tells Apocalypse, hey, we need to get this done. Apocalypse makes restored balance. And effectively, these two would work as a tandem partnership, where both Pokemon basically would contact one another in order to keep the order of Kalos as a whole. Now, this is where the theory obviously goes into, because something had to have caused a rift between both. Something that had caused a divide so important that it actually split both of the order Pokemon apart, where they actually had to deal with one another in an aggressive manner and became adversaries. And by the end of that situation, Kalos would have suffered. Hey guys, this is part of the video where I tell you to like and subscribe. Little reminder as we go into the theory more that we are on the race to 250 subs, and I would love it if you guys could join. Thank you so much, and let's get back into the programming. So as we look at the situation between these two Pokemon that I've theorized, this theory really starts to show more of how the story develops for what we would get in terms of X and Y story, as I do believe this is where the conflict takes place between these two Pokemon. As I think Zygarde and my version of this Pokemon, which would be Apocalypse, would eventually have conflict, but the reason their conflict starts is because of something that hadn't been implemented exactly, and it would take a greater hold. And that is obviously the presence of people and Pokemon in the region with them. So it's not necessarily stated, but I would believe that this is the case, that Zygarde as a Pokemon was revered by the people of Kalos at the time, as they realized and recognized that although it was very powerful and it looks threatening, Zygarde did not directly cause any harm to them, as Zygarde is an enforcer of order, as the humans lived in order and peace in tandem with nature and Pokemon and everything. I believe Zygarde did not see them as a direct threat to itself and the environment, so Zygarde effectively left them alone. However, this would be different for something like Apocalypse, which I think, because of its ability to effectively choose life and death and create it for areas, Apocalypse would be worshipped, or this Pokemon would be worshipped by the people of Kalos at the time, the early people, and they would see its magnificent powers and want to worship it. But also, this would cause a problem as Apocalypse began to like the people and started to enjoy the praise it would get, which means it would be susceptible as it began to realize that its powers were for far more than just it, keeping order. As I do think this would happen when people would pray to Apocalypse and ask it to clear areas of land so that they could build, towns and villages and whatnot. So it did so. And then the people would eventually start to build on these areas where Apocalypse would have wiped out, the forest and the land. Then we move into a situation where maybe there was barren fields in a drought year, and they would wish and ask and pray for Apocalypse to help fix that issue, and so forth. Since Apocalypse loved the praise, it did such that, and it made fields bare into flourishing, crops. And normally this wouldn't have been a problem, as I do think for a while, Zygarde probably ignored this situation and it definitely enjoyed the fact that Apocalypse at this point would have technically been like a friend or companion Pokemon, or at least a partner in this situation. It probably realized that maybe Apocalypse wasn't that dangerous and everything it was doing was fine. However, Zygarde was going to notice there was a big problem, and I do think this is where the conflict rifts off. Now, normally people would say, why would it rift with Zygarde specifically? And that's because Zygarde still adhered to its original duty and its abilities to protect the environment. And it noticed that the people over time, with the help of Apocalypse, were beginning to change, and they changed by first arming and becoming more militaristic, which I think is a normal thing, that they would have gathered their powers, believing that they were stronger, and this led to the formation of at least what I think would be the first form of the Kalos Knights. I'm just kind of using Wickstrom here as an example, but you guys kind of get where I'm going with this, is that this would have been the original beginning of them being created in this time of having benefits, having an actual, goal and almost a lore to follow in the form of Apocalypse, that these knights or these soldiers began to appear and arm up as they began to want to dominate the area. And, obviously Zygarde would not like this, because this was going to cause massive instability among the ecosystem as well, because anytime a war takes place, regardless if they're actually destroying the environment or not, it causes problems, because people will fight and it will cause destruction to the environment as a whole. So this obviously would be the situation where I think Zygarde would come to Apocalypse and tell it that it would need to use its powers in order to stop the people that it had already aided. Now, this is the time period, I believe, where the rift massively begins, because obviously Zygarde doesn't understand that Apocalypse has attachments to these people, but also it has gained something that, obviously Zygarde hasn't, but because it's been spending too much time with people and it had been using its powers recklessly to help them, we have this part where Apocalypse probably believes that it's greater and more powerful than even Zygarde, which at this point it probably is not. And I don't know if it'd be a one-to-one representation, even with it being the manifestation of life and death, but I do think that Zygarde in its complete form can still take down Apocalypse. This is just because Apocalypse has been susceptible to its greed and its malice itself, but it's also become very prideful, believing that it is the more superior Pokemon to Zygarde, because obviously it governs life and death, but because the people worship it, which would lead to the massive conflict, I believe, that takes place probably about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Because I do believe that this would be a back and forth struggle with Apocalypse and Zygarde for a very long time, where this rift breaks and Zygarde effectively realizes that Apocalypse is not going to fulfill its original deal and plan with them, and Zygarde has no choice, as Apocalypse would probably aid the humans continuously to the point where they would upset the ecosystem. This leads to probably the first conflict before the original war talked about in X and Y, where Apocalypse and the people that it was aiding basically start to mount their assault and start attacking the Kalos region to dominate, against all the other people and Pokemon in the region. So obviously then we have Zygarde versus Apocalypse, which takes place for probably hundreds of years. I could see Zygarde defeating Apocalypse and not being afraid of Apocalypse, but the bigger problem for, I think, Zygarde would be that Apocalypse's strength was not in its ability to simply be more powerful. than Zygarde. It was the fact that the people began to side with Apocalypse, obviously, because Apocalypse was basically revered by them. So you would see situations where Zygarde would defeat Apocalypse, but then the next time they fought, Apocalypse didn't fight alone. The Pokemon that had been raised by the people fought alongside Apocalypse, and this was causing problems. And then you can kind of see what happens. You start to see the formation of two groups of people in the form of those allied with Apocalypse, and then the people who are obviously being attacked by these people forming an alliance and working with Zygarde in order to restore order to the region, which would lead to probably would be the precursors to, that would lead to the future events of the story of X and Y. So pretty much we have both of them going at it, and it would lead to the creation. And this is kind of why I would believe that it would make sense that if Zygarde is the order Pokemon, Apocalypse had to have been known as the Chaos Pokemon. And its explanation to its purpose in the region and what would come after is very much up in shadows, but I do have a theory to connect with this. So obviously we're getting two theories. You're getting one here and then one coming out shortly. But the point is, I believe this is what Apocalypse did, and I just believe this is how Zygarde actually became the true order Pokemon because of this other legendary who was the Chaos Pokemon, bringing havoc to the region and destabilizing it as a whole. So pretty much, guys, that's what I have for you today. This is my first big theory for ZA. I do not know how it will age, whether it's going to have any representation on what the game will be, because obviously they probably have it in development, so they know what they want to work with. But this could be an outline to what we can see and what could possibly be. So of course, guys, I hope you guys did like this. If you did, leave a like, comment, and let me know what you think. If you didn't like it, also let me know what you think, because this is my first time trying to craft a bigger theory for something coming out, as I've always been working with stuff that's already existed, and this one is really a big push because we don't know what we're going to get. So, just let me know. But yeah, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.